All right, guys, so let's look at what happens in a distribution waterfall. When a private equity firm does well, or frankly, sometimes just gets lucky, the value of the investment can grow substantially. And so then the question becomes what to do with the proceeds realized. In a distribution waterfall, generally the first step is to return dollars invested to the limited partners. Most carry structures also allow for a preferred return to the limited partners. So before the general partnership realizes any compensation, the investors get their capital back plus the preferred return. Next, under step 3, we have the catch-up. This is paid to the general partnership and is generally equivalent to 20% of the cash inflows from step 2 and 3, or the cash inflows from step 1, 2, and 3. And we'll explore both of those in videos associated with those templates. After the catch-up, all remaining cash inflows are split between the GP and the LP on an 80-20 basis. And if it helps to think about it as a waterfall, you can think of the cash inflows flowing through this bar. So here you would see first dollars out being the original capital returned to the investors plus their preferred return, and then the catch-up to the general partnership, and after that for each additional dollar of cash distributed, 80 cents goes to the investors and 20 cents goes to the general partnership. So hopefully this gives us a mental framework and a strong visual to work with as we explore these templates in a little more detail. All right, team, so now that we've established a mental framework, let's look at some examples in Excel. And what we're going to do is explore 3 different examples, tabs 1 through 3, with the third example being perhaps the most traditional private equity distribution waterfall. But we're going to start with tab 1 and only add a little bit of math each time so that you really understand the sequence. So let's look at what we're going to do on tab 1. If this is our ultimate objective, then to get started, what we're going to do to reduce some complexity is eliminate the catch-up and just look at how to calculate the split after we've returned the principal invested and the preferred return to the limited partners. So we'll get started by going to tab 1. And at the top under transaction, this is effectively all we're looking at. Below that, under equity participants, we have the GP and the LP, which we've discussed and defined previously. And finally, we have our equity participation terms, which we have described as steps. And we can see that back on our whiteboard, where you can see that steps 1 and 2 have been combined into a single line item, return of principal to limited partners plus an 8% cumulative return on principal. And then of course step 3, which is the 80-20 split between the GP and the LP. Below that you have the IRR hurdle, where we have a preferred return of 8%. So what we need to do is determine what an 8% annualized return from 12/31/2020 to 12/31/2025 looks like in this example. And to do that, we're using this formula, which is the positive value for the capital invested multiplied by 1 plus the preferred return and raised to the number of years between 12/31/2020 and 12/31/2025. And you can visualize what the function yearfrac does by highlighting it and pressing F9. Now, should that formula still be a little bit confusing to you, we can look at it here on the tab Formula Explanation. And all we're saying is that if something grows by 8% for 5 years, then the value at the conclusion of that period is $14,693,281. And below, just to confirm, we have the same formula. So now that we've determined the value of the principal plus the preferred return, we can walk through the first step of our waterfall. So initially, all we're saying is that we want the lesser of 2 values, being either the total proceeds achieved, or the value of the first hurdle. In that way, if you don't have enough proceeds to reach the first hurdle, you will only return that lesser value. And if your proceeds are in excess of the first hurdle, as they are here, then you will only return the first hurdle. Now, before moving on to the second distribution, we need to determine the proceeds remaining. This is a very simple calculation. We look at total proceeds and subtract proceeds distributed in the first distribution. That gives us proceeds remaining. Now, in this first example, all that remains is the 80-20 split. We've already distributed capital invested and the preferred return. So the rest is really pretty easy. You take proceeds remaining and multiply by 20% for the GP, and then for the limited partners, proceeds remaining and multiply by 80%. Finally, in the last step, all we're doing is summing the distributions. So for the GP, we have cash flows distributed under second distribution, and for the limited partners, we have cash flows distributed in the first distribution and in the second distribution. And finally, at the bottom, you'll see that the distributions equal the total proceeds. And with that, we're done with the first example. All right, team, so let's take a moment to talk about calculating the catch-up. This is something that I've received a lot of emails about, so I really thought it would help to just isolate it. So let's quickly revisit where we are so far. We know how to calculate steps 1 and 2. And now we're trying to determine the proceeds required for the catch-up, which in the second template we will be working with is equivalent to 20% of steps 1 and 2, which is the return of principal and the 8% preferred return. It obviously follows that steps 1 and 2 are 80% of this total sum. And if that's true, then the way to calculate the catch-up is to simply divide the total proceeds in step 1 and 2 by 80%. And that's it. That's the whole thing. I think it can be pretty simple if we break it down. Hopefully this visual will make the Excel template something that's a little bit easier to tackle, so we can move on to that in the next video. And in the final video, we will make an adjustment to how the catch-up is calculated to reflect the most commonly used waterfall. All right, so now in this video, we'll be moving from the first example to the second example and introducing the catch-up in an Excel template. As a quick reminder, on the first template, the waterfall worked through these steps: return of principal, the preferred return, and then an 80-20 split. And on the next template, we will be introducing the catch-up, and then again calculating the 80-20 split. So we will be starting on the tab titled 20% and 80-20. Now on this tab, everything through the first distribution is identical to the process that we went through on the tab titled 80-20 previously. So we can really just resume where we left off with row 46 on second distribution. And what we're saying here is that now the GP is entitled to 20% of all distributions made up to this point, including this step. So let's work through this formula off to the side. As we just illustrated, the sum of all cash flows distributed, including the return of principal, the preferred return, and the catch-up, is equivalent to the sum of cash flows included in the distribution for the return of principal and the preferred return, divided by 80%. And since for the second distribution, we only want to know the value of the catch-up, you simply subtract the return of principal and the preferred return from this value. And that's the value of the catch-up, assuming we have sufficient proceeds. And in the event that we do not have sufficient proceeds, we use the min function to select the lesser value, whether that be proceeds remaining or the value of the catch-up we just calculated. And because proceeds remaining are far in excess of the catch-up, in this instance, it returns the value we calculated off to the right. After that, we again calculate proceeds remaining after the second distribution. And in the third distribution, these remaining proceeds are again split 80-20. And then finally below, under grand total proceeds, we sum the distributions to the GP, including the Ketchup and the 20% split after the Ketchup, and to the limited partners, which includes the return of principal and the preferred return, and the 80% split after the Ketchup. And then again at the bottom, you'll see that our proceeds in row 9 are equal to our total proceeds in row 62. And the nice thing about this distribution waterfall as an educational example is that so long as there are sufficient proceeds to work past the second distribution, the total split between the GP and LP will work out perfectly to 20% and 80%, which makes it pretty easy to check your math. All right, guys. We have one more minor tweak before this video series concludes. But at this point, we have a fully functional waterfall. It's just a little bit more favorable to the GP than what might otherwise be expected. And I'll explain why that is in the next example. All right, team. Next, we will be transitioning from tab 2 to tab 3 to look at the most common example of a distribution waterfall. But before we dive into the Excel template, I wanted to explore the language behind the distribution waterfall. I often think this might be the reason people find it confusing, but now that we've provided a lot of context, I think it will appear simple. So the first step is 100% of all cash inflows to the LP until cumulative distributions equal the original capital invested. The second is 100% of all cash inflows to the LP until the LP has received a preferred return on the capital invested in step 1. Third, a 20% catch-up to the GP equivalent to 20% of the distributions realized in step 1 and 2, plus the distributions realized in this step. And finally, the 80-20 split. And as before, the blue color indicates a distribution to the LP, and green, a distribution to the GP. And this is the first catch-up example we just explored. And now we're going to make a small change for the second example. The change in the second example comes in the third step. None of the other language here has changed. But whereas before, we had the catch-up equivalent to all distributions realized in step 1, 2, and the third step, here it's only 20% of the distributions realized in step 2 plus the distributions realized in this step. So in our second example, the catch-up is only 20% of steps 2 and 3. Whereas in the first example, the catch-up was equivalent to 20% of steps 1, 2, and 3. To provide one more visual, let's go back to our catch-up calculation. So whereas before, we were dividing all distributions in step 1 and 2 by 80%, to calculate the value of all distributions realized in steps 1, 2, and 3. In this third example, we will only be dividing the distributions made in step 2 by 80% to arrive at the value of the distributions made in steps 2 and 3. And of course, you can see the ultimate impact of that is that the value of the catch-up is much smaller. So back in the workbook, now we can go to the tab titled 20% After Principal and 80-20. And on this tab, the only thing that has changed from the prior tab is the calculation for the catch-up in cell D48. Whereas before, we divided the entire first distribution of roughly $14.7 million by 80%. Now we are subtracting from that value the original principal investment. So we have the value in cell D43 minus D35, which is the preferred return, divided by 80%. And then we subtract the value of the preferred return which leaves us only with the value of the ketchup of roughly $1.2 million. And as we stated in our whiteboard example, what this does is drastically reduce the value of the second distribution. Here we see that the ketchup on the previous tab worked out to approximately $3.7 million. And now in this new example, it's only roughly $1.2 million. Otherwise, the math on this worksheet mirrors the math on the prior worksheet. It's the only additional change. Now I want to leave you with a few things to think about. First, it's always important to check your math with these kinds of templates. Now this tab doesn't provide us the clean outcome that we had on the prior tab. You'll see below that next to grand total proceeds, roughly 13% went to the GP and 87% to the limited partners. But if you want to check your math, recreate what is outlined in the document. So here, for example, you could take the value of your ketchup and divide it by the value of the preferred return. So subtract the principal invested plus the value of the ketchup. Press enter and you should have 20%. And as a final item, let's take a quick look at why we include all of these min-max functions. If the proceeds had been $15 million instead of $30 million, then you'll see that the waterfall falls short of the third distribution, and that the second distribution is only equivalent to the proceeds remaining, because we don't have enough proceeds for the entire ketchup. This kind of flexibility allows you to play with a lot of different scenarios. If you input proceeds of $12 million, for example, we don't have sufficient proceeds for the ketchup at all. Running through these kinds of iterations can also help you check your work, which can be very valuable as waterfall schedules get more complex. All right, I hope that makes distribution waterfalls easier to build and understand. Thanks for watching.